Morning. Great to see everybody in church. Makes me look very official having that thing up there, doesn't it? Wouldn't it be great if there's something more to go up there, but there's not. All right, so today we're continuing through the series on our TCAT process. Pastor Nick talked to us last week about the turn process, and today we're actually going to be looking at the complaint part of the process. And it's always a bit of a tricky one, because as a child often we're told, don't complain. At school, all the kids run around saying, you get what you get and you don't get upset. Anybody heard that? I hadn't before I started working at a school, but... So I was just having a think about, what does the word complain actually mean? If we've probably all got slightly different ideas in our head, and sometimes when I'm thinking through it, I realise there's probably some nuances about it in my head that maybe don't exist anywhere else. But so I went and looked up the dictionary, and the word complain means to, and I'm sure there's no surprises here, I'm sure you all know what it means, to express grief, pain, uneasiness, censure, resentment or dissatisfaction, or to find fault, or it's to tell of one's pains or ailments, or sometimes to state a grievance or make a formal accusation. And in my head, and that little nuance that I talked about in my head a little while ago, it seems to be a step up from just grumbling. Often we hear the term good-natured grumbling, and I don't know, sometimes I think that's a bit of a misnomer. Sometimes it is actually just a part of our, the way we relate to each other. In Australia, we love to be sarcastic and have a lend of people. But it seems to me, when you, for example, if you ring up Telstra and you say you have a complaint, it's a step past just having a bit of a grumble. Oh, Telstra's at it again, but you haven't really got any realistic expectation that your situation's going to change. Whereas if you ring up and ask for the department where it takes complaints and you say, I have a complaint, to me, in my head, it implies it's an intention to initiate some sort of action or follow through with a desire or a plan to actually change an outcome or change a situation. And I started thinking about, did a little concordance search for the actual word complaint in the Bible, and then I realised that it wasn't actually that helpful, because a lot of the complaining in the Bible doesn't match the word complaint or have the complaint in it. And all this stuff came up, and most of you could probably guess where it was. I think Jeremiah did some complaining, and there's complaining all through the Psalms. The classic is Job. We'll touch on a little bit on Job in a little while. Today I'm actually going to be talking mostly about Habakkuk. Who can spell Habakkuk? I meant to bring along a chocolate or something to see if anybody could spell if I spring it on them. Who'd like to have a crack at spelling the word Habakkuk? Good guess, but no. It does have a double something somewhere, you're exactly right, Janice. Actually, I noticed I thought I knew how to spell it, and then I had two dry runs before I actually read it. I went, oh, okay. Any other takers? No? Oh, did she? It's probably... That's it. HABA, double K, UK. Yeah. Well done, Sue. All right, so we're going to talk about a couple of other little other things first, but we will get to Habakkuk. So often a complaint will occur. Someone will complain when they feel that they've been... they're more likely to complain if they feel like they've been unjustly treated or unjustly dealt with, as opposed to just when they're not really feeling the vibe today, they don't feel great. Well, like I said before, they're maybe not expecting anything to actually change. So we often hear sorry, getting ahead of myself. It's one of the little things. This has actually got nothing to do with anything really. It was just one of the little things that I couldn't help noticing as I go through. That's the random way my brain works. If you look at the word complaint, you only got to change the position of one letter and it becomes compliant. The opposite could very well be said too. You only got to look at the word compliant and you've got to move one letter and it becomes complaint. But it was interesting. It kicked off a little interesting little thought process in my head and went down this giant rabbit hole, and I think I've come out of it now, but it was interesting. You also get, remember Lois saying one time, she was talking about something that Pastor Steve used to say, which I think in some way I always knew, but it was interesting to hear it actually articulated in the way. She was talking about the difference between love and hate, or the opposite of love. And sometimes, when we're kids, we think the opposite of love is when you hate something. I remember Pastor Steve used to say, the opposite of love is actually being completely indifferent to it. And I'm quite fond of regaling the young people in my life, with my young people at home and also the ones I work with at school, with stories about my younger days as involved in sport. And you have days when you swear your swimming coach hates you. And because I won't tell the story again. I think I've told it to a lot of people here before. But I had one particular one where just one morning I was like, this swimming coach hates me. I'm never going back. And but she was just doing a job. And if she actually didn't care about me, well, she would have just let me spend my money and let me swim in the corner over there and not bothered about it. And I would have got nothing out of it. But the fact that she was there riding me meant that she cared. So I think probably everybody... So when someone feels strongly enough about something to complain, usually means they care about it. They're wanting change. It's a bit different to sort of writing it off and thinking, okay, that's never going to change. I'm just going to drop it and just go the completely other direction. So I'm sure everybody could probably think of a time when they've been frustrated by something, however small or however large. But how many times have you realised in hindsight that the frustration or the complaining is actually the start of a valuable, although undesirable and unpleasant, but often completely necessary process that's taught you a valuable lesson that you wouldn't otherwise have learned? And I guess just a little trivial example of that was, remember when I was swimming coaching back down in Toowoomba, and one afternoon I was working with a junior squad, which most of the kids there were sort of between probably 9 and 10 years old. You get the odd 8-year-old and the odd 11-year-old, but mostly around about that 9, 10-year-old mark. And we were doing breaststroke. And I was lucky enough to work for a very professional outfit who had very good systems for training up their coaches. And just so you understand the context of the story, when you do your butterfly arm pull, we've got an out sweep at the top and then you've got a V pull, so this here. Whereas breaststroke, you actually leave your hands further out in front. Breaststroke's more of a sculling thing. And one young girl was swimming up and down, and I pulled her up and said, hey, look, when you're doing your breaststroke, we're not pulling your hands back this way, we're actually digging in and sweeping in this way. And she's like, righto, and she started doing the exact same thing. He pulled her up again. Hang on. Do you remember what we just talked about? Yeah, I'm doing it. I said, okay. So off she went. Pulled her up again. No, actually, sweetie, you're not doing it. And she got frustrated. Like this, happened over a few minutes. And she got frustrated. She said, but you're supposed to do the V-pull. And then I think, I hadn't realised until that moment that she had the two actions mixed up in her head. The fact that she got frustrated and, didn't throw it back in my face, but the fact she got frustrated, and that clued me onto the fact that she was proceeding with the wrong information. And then once we were able to clear that up, you should have seen the light bulb go on her face, because she'd been struggling with this for weeks and weeks, and all of a sudden she's going up and down and said, I can do breaststroke now. She was wanting to do breaststroke for the whole rest of the day. But it wasn't until she got to that point where she didn't understand what was going on and had a bit of a growl that it was actually able to be fixed. Lots of accounts of people grumbling in the Bible. Israelites did it incessantly. But the question I sort of in my head was, does God actually encourage us or desire us to complain? Or does he prefer us, or actually in fact ask us to trust him without doubting or complaining? Sometimes it seems, when you read the New Testament, it's all about, pray without ceasing, do everything joyfully. I think it's Philippians chapter 2 verse 4 is, do everything without grumbling. It seems like that's talking about, grumbling to each other. So what we're going to talk about today is when we're actually taking our grievances to God, to the guy who can actually do something about it. So complaint seems to be, it's often the starting point for revelation, for change and growth, even though it can be a long, hard road of discovery, pain, and learning from hard knocks and from experience. So obviously the Psalms are very well known for their direct, frank, and honest language in taking hurt, doubt, fear, and other emotions to God. Lots of people I've met over the years have just loved the Psalms. They've always used the Psalms as a vehicle to pray through things, or just to increase their knowledge of God and their relationship with God. My father was one. In his younger days, before he was married, he actually spent some time in Vietnam, not as a combatant, but he was in the Salvation Army. So he was actually there as a part of a program which I believe was called Red Shield, which is essentially like being an army chaplain. And one of the ways he used to pass his time over there was praying through the Psalms. And I remember there was one, I don't remember our father offering us money very often. Money was never used as an incentive for anything. Like money was really... at my dad's funeral, it was interesting hearing all the stories about people who knew my dad in his younger days and how far he could make a dollar stretch. But I remember when I was about 10, going on 11, he actually offered us $10 if we memorised Psalm 119. I mean, back then, with $10, that was like you could buy anything with $10 back then. None of us actually did it. But it was interesting that it was the one of the things that he cared enough about to actually say. There wasn't any other times when he would offer us money to do things. I think Pastor Nick shared last week about a psalm. So we're going to move on to other things. Job. I don't know how many people have actually read the book of Job through. And if you did, it's keeping track of who's talking to who and when and why is quite an endeavour. The book starts off by describing how upright and God-fearing Job is. So this is a man who, when he had everything taken away, could actually worship God and say, genuinely, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So in verse 22... it says that during this whole process, so this was before he actually became sick. This is just when the first time the devil was allowed to take away his possessions and his family. Up at that point, the Bible says he did not sin or charge God with wrong. But then all of these terrible things happened after that to a man who by all accounts deserved none of it. So in Job chapter 2 verse 10, so after Satan struck him with boils, his wife essentially told him, curse God and die. He's forgotten about you. And then it says after that, he still did not sin with his lips. But later in the book of Job, there's a lot of discourse between Job and the three men who came to try and comfort him. So when they came, it says that they raised their voices and wept, tore their robes, sprinkled dust on their heads. They sat with Job on the ground for 7 days and nights without saying a word. So they're obviously very sobered by the amount of suffering that they were witnessing. So between chapter 2, where Job hasn't said anything against God, and chapter 10, there's a big, big change. So essentially, Job essentially he dared to speak to God almost as an equal. He comes close to outright unjustified indignation at what God has allowed to happen. He knows he's not wicked. He tells God that he's unjust in oppressing him. But at the same time, he also has to acknowledge that there's nobody who can come between him and God. Whatever God decides to do is going to be done. He can't do anything about what's happening, and it's in that place of complete frustration and anguish that he vents his frustrations to God. However, at the end of the book, in chapter 42, talks about, I'd never thought of Job as having to repent necessarily, but that's what it says in the Bible. You know, the little subtitle is "He repents and he's restored." But somehow in that whole process, he's actually comes to an even deeper relationship with God than what he actually already had. Another one was Moses. So I've just picked, there's a little snippet of the whole experience of Moses and the Israelites. They were often grumbling. Moses was often frustrated. God got frustrated with the people as well. Sometimes Moses interceded for the people to God. And this particular instance was Numbers chapter 11, verses 11 to 15. So essentially what had happened here is the people had been eating manna. They were tired of eating manna and they decided they wanted some meat like they had back in Egypt. Lots of times they saying, oh, you know, you've just brought us out here to die, we might as well be back in Egypt, at least we could eat. And just after this, so Moses actually went to God. Sorry, I've neglected to put that text in my notes. Just excuse me for a minute while I find it. If you want to follow along, it's in Numbers chapter 11. And so we've just had the people have just been grumbling because they've been eating manna, even though there was enough to eat. Was probably, I don't know how you guys would go eating the same thing day after day after day, but I know I'd get sick of it too. So we'll pick it up in verse 10. So Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of the tent, and the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and Moses was also displeased. Moses said to the Lord, so this is where he's actually having a go at God. Why have you dealt ill with your servant? And why have I not found favour in your sight, that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive these people? Did I conceive all this people? Did I give them birth, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land that you swore to give their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give all these people? For they weep before me and say, give us meat that we may eat. I'm not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once, if I find favour in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness. And part of me initially was a little surprised, because I remember it's been a fair while since I've read Numbers and paid a lot of attention to it, but it's sort of one of the reasons that it struck me was if you go travelling a little bit further in chapter 12, there's an interesting little episode where Mary and Aaron actually have a little clash with Moses, and there's just a little sideline in there. It's actually quite an incidental sort of mention, but there's a comment that's made about Moses' humility. It actually says that Moses was a very humble man. He was more humble than all the men who are on the face of the earth. This most humble man on the face of the earth basically shirt-fronted God and said, "What are you doing?" Just after that was when Moses actually was told by God to select the 70 elders, and not only did he gain 70 assistants, but God actually gave them the same spirit that He had given Moses. So these elders were actually spirit empowered. You can see that in verse 17 of Numbers 11. On to Habakkuk. Habakkuk seems to be quite unique among the prophets in that instead of actually bringing a message from God to the people, hear ye, this is what you must do, this is what's going to happen, he was actually going to asking God questions on behalf of the people. So at the time it was seemed very similar to what we heard about Amos last year. The people were doing stuff they weren't supposed to do. They were treating each other horribly. And Habakkuk was actually saying to God, "I don't understand why you haven't just struck us all dead now. What I'm seeing is just horrible." I'm actually going to read a section of Habakkuk. I'm going to be blasphemous and read it from the Message. I feel like it just gives you a bit more of an idea of, fuller expression of his feelings. The little headline here. I'm in Habakkuk chapter 1. The little headline here is "Justice is a joke." The problem as God gave Habakkuk to see it. God, how long do I have to cry out for help before you listen? How many times do I have to yell, "Help, murder, police," before you come to the rescue? Why do you force me to look at evil, stare trouble in the face, day after day? Anarchy and violence break out, quarrels and fights all over the place. Law and order fall to pieces. Justice is a joke. The wicked have the righteous hamstrung and stand justice on its head. So essentially, Habakkuk's gone to ask God with the question, "Don't you see this? What are you going to do about it? I can't stand watching it anymore." So he was essentially just like us in that he wanted to know what God was doing and why he was doing it. However, God's answer to Habakkuk's question horrified him. So when he asked why God didn't stop the people of Judah, he essentially was told that God was going to allow, God essentially said to him, "You know those barbaric people who have been enslaving everybody around and killing people and carrying people off? I'm going to let them come and sort it out." And Habakkuk just couldn't believe that God was going to allow a wicked heathen nation like the Babylonians to punish God's own chosen people in their own land. So even though the Israelites were doing the wrong thing, surely the Babylonians were much, much worse. And in verse 13 of chapter 1, he actually accuses God of just that. So verse 13 says, so I'll pick it up in verse 12. "God, you're from eternity, aren't you? Holy God, we aren't going to die, are we? God, you chose Babylonians for your judgment work. Rock solid God, you gave them the job of discipline. You cannot be serious. You can't condone evil. Why don't you do something about this? Why are you silent now? The outrage. Evil men swallow up the righteous, and you stand around and watch." So the way that he directly questions God is interesting. Most times in the Bible that I can sort of think of off the top of my head, when someone asks God a question and God answers, they accept it, whether they like it or not. But Habakkuk essentially goes back to God with a second complaint. There's a little quote I'd like to read here from a Bible dictionary that I came across. And this is their words. It's from the Nelson's Bible Dictionary. They said, "This direct question seems to indicate that Habakkuk had great faith. Only a person very close to God would dare question the purposes of the Almighty so boldly. God assured Habakkuk that the Babylonians would not prevail not because they were righteous, but because they were temporarily being used by God as instruments of justice in his hands. So I'm sure most of you guys can think of a time when God's asked you to do something that doesn't make sense, or he's asked you to ignore something that's rubbing you up the wrong way, or something about what God's asking you to do is just find it really hard to do. But somehow after he'd made his second complaint to God, before he actually had the answer, he actually came to a point where he was able to wait. Just at the end of chapter 1, he's asking God, are you going to let this go on and on? Will you let this Babylonian fisherman fish like a weekend angler, killing people as if they're nothing but fish? And that's where his second complaint ends. And then in the beginning of chapter 2, he says, what is God going to say to my questions? I'm braced for the worst. I'll climb to the lookout tower and scan the horizon. I will wait to see what God says and how he will answer my complaint. Now, I don't actually know, and it's not really important necessarily, but I was curious to wonder how long it was between God. Often it sort of reads as pretty immediate in the book, and maybe it was. I don't know whether you guys have ever started seeking God about something in particular, but often the times that I've done it, the answer hasn't come very quickly. There's been some waiting and some searching and some re-asking, and sometimes it even seems like God's talking about everything but the thing that you want him to answer. But however long it was, whether it was immediate or whether it took a little while, he was in that place where he could say, I'll wait and see what God says. He obviously had complete conviction that God would answer. And it sounded like he was actually prepared to get slammed too. So God then goes on to tell Habakkuk how he's going to judge the wicked, how his plans would ultimately be fulfilled. And even though Habakkuk didn't like them, even though he didn't understand them, we see in the 3rd chapter of Habakkuk that that process that he's gone through has actually allowed him to come to a point where he can acknowledge and accept God's sovereignty over all nations and over all outcomes. So, what do we do with all this? Some of this process of preparing for this made me think about some other things that I've sort of come across in the last few years. A few years ago, with my SU training, with our conferences and PD and stuff that we do, we usually have a speaker. And this time it was a pastor from down Rockhampton somewhere. His name was Matthew King. And he came along and did a series of messages on the idea of the God of the gaps. He talked a lot about Abraham and the fact that often when we look at Abraham, we have little snippets recorded of his life. But in between, there were periods of years, sometimes decades, where he essentially had to wait and be faithful before he could see God's promise come to fruition. Sometimes he knew what was coming, but he just couldn't see how it was going to work. So often, it was a fascinating concept, and he did like 3, whole sections on it, 3 whole sessions. But it made me wondering, when we've got this complaint, there's this gap between where we are and what we want, and we don't know what's going to happen in between here and there. But when we take it, the best way is obviously what we're getting at is to take it directly to God. There's a gap between what we want and what God wants for us, what God knows is best for us. There's a gap between our complaint and the answer. There's a gap between where we are and the destination. And then we just have to be in that space where we need to be prepared to wait. We tend to feel that, we want to fill that gap with something when we're living in what I think I've heard Pastor Nick refer to as now but not yet. Now we know God's doing something. It might be hard, it might be confusing, we might not understand it, we might disagree with it. So we can either fill that gap with something useful, pray, act in a way that's showing our faith to God, preparing for what might come next. But sometimes we fill that gap with doubt, with fear, with impatience. And he made an interesting point. He said waiting is not the same as being delayed. Just because we're waiting doesn't mean that God's been caught up or something that God's planned has not come out. We've got any Lord of the Rings fans here? Do you remember in the first movie when, I can't remember exactly how the movie starts, but when it switches to that scene in the Shire and it's got Gandalf chugging along in his wagon and Bilbo's sitting under a tree reading a book and he hears the wagon coming. He jumps up and intercepts him and then he comes up the top of a hill and Gandalf pulls up the wagon and just sits there and Bilbo stands on the top of the hill and says, "You're late." Anybody remember that? Am I the only one who watches it? Sorry, my mistake. It is Frodo. Thank you, Benny. That's the quizzical looks I was getting. Frodo said to Gandalf, "You're late." Does anybody remember what Gandalf said in reply? "A wizard is never early and he's never late. He arrives precisely when he means to." And sometimes it's frustrating that we don't know when God means to arrive or when God means to implement whatever it is, whatever this good thing that he tells us is going to happen. And it's difficult, but our perception of a delay, it's hard not to, when we are perceiving a delay, when we feel like it's taking too long and we don't know what to do in the meantime, it's easy for us to doubt, to fear, to be impatient. And sometimes it's a question of, do we have that relationship with God? Have we built that relationship with God? Do we have that security and familiarity to be brutally honest with God and be brutally honest with ourselves? 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 7. Anybody know what it says? Don't think it's that one. That's it. Cast all your cares upon him because he cares for us. And sometimes we spout that verse very quickly and tritely, if that's a word. So I've got my message book up here again. Be content with who you are. This is verse 6. Don't put on airs. God's strong hand is on you. He'll promote you at the right time. Live carefree before God. He is most careful with you. It's interesting, the little subhead straight after that is he gets the last word, which I think is quite apt. Romans chapter 1 verse 17 is actually, Paul is actually directly quoting Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 4. I'm always interested to see how often the writers of the New Testament directly quote the Old Testament. They obviously had a huge respect for it. I'm So this vision is a witness pointing to what's coming. This is Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 4. It's the saying that the just shall live by faith. And I believe Galatians chapter 3 verse 11 is a similar thing. So sometimes we can, and this is another point that this pastor down in Rockhampton made, he said sometimes we can equate doubt and uncertainty with disbelief. And I know Pastor Nick's been talking about this as well. Sometimes we need to get to the point where it's okay to sit for a while with our doubt, to sit with our questions, to wrestle with our fear, wrestle with our worry, take it to God. In fact, it's not only is it okay, sometimes it's absolutely necessary for us to be able to learn and grow. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I'm praying here now, very aware that there's a lot of people here in this building that have had a lot more in their lives to worry about, to complain about than me. And Father, sometimes, but we all have our things that can get in the way of trusting you. Father, I ask that you would just keep working in our hearts the way that you have been, Father. Keep bringing us to that place where we have that relationship with you, Father, where we can ask, but we can also wait and hope. Amen.